In this second part of the lecture, I'm going to focus entirely on philosopher, sociologist, and theologist Jacques Ellul's 1962 book, Propaganda: The Formation of Men's Attitudes. And actually, by the way, kind of as an aside, sorry that just about all the authors I've been citing, actually even including Hannah Arendt, use the word man to mean human. This is just, sexism runs deep, and that's just something to kind of get through when reading almost anything written really before the 1970s when second wave feminism started to gain some institutional retention. But anyway, so in both the previous part of this lecture and now, I want to try to answer a few questions, right? So first, what is propaganda? Second, what does propaganda do to people? And then third, what does propaganda do for people? The working definition of propaganda that Edward Bernays provided us with was, quote, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses. The author I'm going to talk about in this part of the lecture, Jacques Ellul, actually pointedly refuses to pin down any one specific definition of propaganda, and it's a bit weird to do that in a book titled Propaganda, but I think he wants us to think very broadly kind of about all the different techniques, as he calls them, the techniques for influencing and shaping people's subjectivities. So propaganda for Ellul can include really anything from brainwashing through psychological torture in a communist re-education camp to the evening news presented by your favorite anchorman. Ellul is, I think, mainly focused, that said, Ellul is mainly focused on propaganda that the government and government allies are producing in the media and directing toward their own people, their own countries' populations. So Ellul does want to think about propaganda really in a broad sense, I think in part in order to point out similarities and continuities between different systems of government and different systems of media that we typically think of as completely unalike. So like Herman and Chomsky in their book, Manufacturing Consent, published a couple of decades after Ellul's book, Propaganda, Ellul is saying, look, propaganda isn't just a problem under totalitarian, fascist, or communist governments. We also need to think about how people's minds, including our own minds, are being shaped and manipulated in regimes that call themselves liberal democracies as well and claim to have free presses. And for Ellul, propaganda is ubiquitous in the modern world. Whether the media is state-controlled or private, whether or not politicians are chosen by election, and whether people recognize they're being propagandized or not. And the reason that Ellul thought that propaganda was so widespread, and the reason he thought people were so vulnerable to it, whether they were living in the Western Bloc or the Soviet bloc or in a non-aligned country, was that more than ever before, people were living in mass individualist societies. Urbanization and industrialization had really transformed the way that people lived and the way that society was structured to create the conditions that allowed propaganda to thrive. So I want to explain what Ellul means by mass individualist society, which I think is a key part of his argument. So let's start with this passage. This is from chapter 2 of Propaganda. Quote, "For propaganda to succeed, a society must first have two complementary qualities. It must be both an individualist and a mass society. These two qualities are often considered contradictory. It's believed that an individualist society, in which the individual is thought to have a higher value than the group, tends to destroy groups that limit the individual's range of action, whereas a mass society negates the individual and reduces him to a cipher. But this contradiction is purely theoretical and a delusion. In actual fact, an individualist society must be a mass society because the first move toward liberation of the individuals is to break up the smaller groups that are an organic fact of the entire society. In this process, the individual frees himself completely from family, village, parish, or brotherhood bonds, only to find himself directly vis-a-vis the entire society. When individuals are not held together by local structures, the only form in which they can live together is an unstructured mass society. Similarly, a mass society can only be based on individuals, that is, on men in their isolation, whose identities are determined by their relationships with one another. There's a lot to unpack in that quotation, and maybe it's better to start with the historical argument that's behind Ellul's points here. So according to Ellul, and it's a little bit of a simplification, but in broad strokes, before modernization, before people began to live in huge numbers in city apartments and to work at factories or in office buildings, traditional societies consisted of lots of small groups. Most people lived in villages and were members of a bunch of kind of overlapping small groups. Their extended families, their communities of faith, the people with whom they bought and sold goods on market day, maybe the people who went to the same barber and doctor and dentist, which actually back in traditional society might have all been just one person doing all three of those roles, and so on, all these small groups. So if you lived in a traditional society, almost all of your information about the world would come, well, first of all, from your direct sensory experience of the world, what you saw and felt and smelled. And second, your information would come from communication with other members of these small groups. And most of the issues you were concerned about and expected to have an opinion about were also on this kind of small scale. The local village gossip, the local religious rituals, the weather, I don't know, the best way to farm the land and raise livestock. These were the kind of things that you discussed and argued about in your small groups. And to the extent that you were talking about larger issues, you know, what's going on in the kingdom, you were strongly influenced by your interlocutors in these small groups. And in a sense, these groups kind of insulated you and protected you from big, top-down, centralized propaganda. But then, really starting in the 19th century and continuing up until this day, what we see is a massive transformation of society, which I've already talked about a bit before, especially when discussing Karl Marx, who was a witness to the early stages of this transformation, of industrialization, of modernization. So according to Ellul, the modern reorganization of society and migration to cities had the effect of smashing a lot of the smaller organic groups, as he called them, that were the bases of pre-modern societies. Instead of people living in these small insulated groups, they started living as individuals, each pursuing their own paths in the big city. So that's the individualist part of the mass individualist society. And this individualization of humankind is actually something that a lot of liberal intellectuals, Enlightenment thinkers, celebrated as part of a path toward progress, toward an era of enlightenment and rationality. They thought that it was a good thing that social change was breaking the hold of, you know, the anti-intellectual church, the xenophobic village gossip, even the traditionalist family. It was a good thing that the grip of these small groups over people and people's minds was breaking. So right, instead of just unthinkingly doing what your parents or your pastor or your imam or your rabbi or whatever tell you to do, people start thinking for themselves. That's the hope, is that they start thinking for themselves. They become good, rational citizens participating in the public sphere as individuals, not as unthinking group members. At least this is the hope, right, of these liberal democratic thinkers. But Ellul, who, by the way, was himself deeply religious and identified as a Christian anarchist, Ellul disagreed with that optimistic view of the way that societies were transforming. What Ellul saw instead was that small groups were giving way not to enlightened rational citizenry, but to the masses, to these disconnected masses of individuals. Instead of having tight social bonds with those all around you at the village assembly, at your mosque, at the farmer's market, what happened was that once you moved to the city, you found yourself well, still surrounded by people, right? There are lots of other people around, and you're jostling them on the subway, you're working alongside them in the factory or in adjacent cubicles in the office, waiting behind them in lines at the grocery store or the chain coffee shop or the fast food drive-through or whatever. But you don't have the same kind of close connections with others that you used to. Now, of course, this is a bit of an exaggeration that Ellul is making about kind of the loss of any kind of intimate connection. People who live in the city, right, do still have friends and attend religious services and all that. But he's talking again in broad strokes, and actually he's not the only thinker to lament the kind of decline in small group association and communication. There was a book, for example, a couple of decades ago called Bowling Alone by a political scientist named Robert Putnam that got a lot of attention. And Putnam argued precisely along the same lines that there was a dangerous decline in America specifically in the late 20th century of people joining social clubs, attending religious services, playing in bowling leagues, participating in other kinds of small groups. Putnam pointed to data that small group membership and participation was on the decline. Putnam thought that it was dangerous for democracy, for the health of the public sphere, if instead of people talking to those around them, arguing politics, learning what's going on in the world, either through direct experience or through decentralized communication, he thought it was dangerous that instead of all that, they were just sitting at home watching TV. And similarly, for Jacques Ellul, the creation of a mass individualist society hasn't created a society of rational, deliberative citizens, but instead it's created opportunities for more centralized and thus more dangerous kinds of groupthink than could exist in traditional societies. In the old world, I mean, groupthink still existed. You might be thinking as a group with those around you, but those groups are small, right? And there's lots of different groups kind of balancing each other out. But in the mass individualist society, which Ellul also describes as the technological society, thanks to mass media, groupthink could be centrally controlled. Instead of lots of little groups, each kind of believing their own bullshit, Ellul saw people becoming isolated and disconnected from almost everything except for their TV screen, their radio, their newspaper. Propaganda could thrive in this kind of a society in part because the mass media would broadcast stuff and people no longer had any other channels of information, right, like village or church gossip, to counteract that propaganda and tell them a different story. So the centralization of media control is a big part of the story for Ellul. And I do think that to some extent this is outdated, particularly given that, right, over the past couple of decades we've seen a radical decentralization of media, right? Social media has been a way in which ordinary people are connecting with and sharing information with each other outside the control of the government or owners of the mass media. It's become the case that on social media we're able to form new small groups. But nonetheless, propaganda certainly hasn't gone away, right? And I think what Ellul did not anticipate was the kind of propaganda that's both quickly spreadable on a mass scale and believable precisely because it spreads through these small group local ties, right? Your relative or a member of your congregation or sports team or maybe an influencer who you want to kind of believe and pretend you have some deep connection with. One of those people with whom you're connected posts something on social media, and it seems more credible because of their endorsement. For a discussion of this kind of propaganda, which spreads on social media through kind of these little virtual villages that we've now constructed for ourselves online, we're going to have to wait actually a few weeks until I bring us up to the 21st century and talk about propaganda kind of in the internet age. But for now, I do think that there's more to Ellul's book that's really valuable for getting at questions of why propaganda is produced and why it's consumed, willingly consumed. So first of all, from the supply side of propaganda, from the perspective of the propagandists, ruling over mass society depends on consent, on compliance, on public opinion. It used to be the case, right, that the king or the emperor got to rule because they were chosen by God, and it didn't matter all that much what, the peasants thought about that. But there's been a cultural shift around the world over the last couple centuries, which in fact has gone hand in hand with the development of mass individualist society. There's been this change where you have to at least pay kind of lip service to democracy and to serving the people. There's been a change to where, as Walter Lippmann put it, you have to manufacture the consent of the governed. And that's true even in countries that aren't democracies in the sense of holding free and fair elections, right? Nowadays, even dictators at least stage fake elections and talk about serving, the will of the people. So public opinion is important, but like Walter Lippmann, Ellul definitely does not see public opinion as just something that kind of forms naturally on its own and outside of the ruling system and then acts upon the government, right? Tells governments how to govern. Instead, public opinion is something that's created, that's manufactured through propaganda to get people, at least enough of the people, in their public expressions of opinion, to say that they support what the government, in most cases, already wanted to do. In the absence of propaganda, public opinion, what people want, is, Ellul says, always kind of vague and confused, and it's constantly changing, right? And the public, in a certain sense, kind of needs direction, which is precisely what propaganda provides. So Ellul writes, quote, "Government propaganda suggests that public opinion demand this or that decision. It provokes the will of the people who spontaneously would have said nothing. But once evoked, formed, and crystallized on a point, that will becomes the people's will. And whereas the government really acts on its own, it gives the impression of obeying public opinion after first having built that public opinion. The point is to make the masses demand of the government what the government has already decided to do. If it follows this procedure, the government can no longer be called authoritarian because the will of the people demands what is being done." And, as a side note, we might think also kind of along the lines that Monroe Price suggests in his argument about the market for loyalties, that, we shouldn't think of just the government as unitary or the elite as unitary, but we can certainly think of different competing political factions all trying to propagandize people to demand what that faction wants, right? That's the whole idea really behind the concept of the market for loyalties. The sellers are trying to get buyers, people, to buy into their ideas, their claims about the world, their solutions, and demand those solutions be done as public policy. So to get back to Ellul, elsewhere he writes, quote, "In a democracy, the citizens must be tied to the decisions of the government. This is the great role propaganda must perform. It must give the people the feeling which they crave and which satisfies them. To, quote, have wanted what the government is doing, to be responsible for its actions, to be involved in defending them and making them succeed, to be, quote, with it." I like that second quotation because it starts to get at the equally important question of the demand side for propaganda in a mass individualist society. That is, of what propaganda does for its recipients, for ordinary people being propagandized. And the shift toward democracy being the basis of legitimacy for government has not only required a change for governments, right, where now they need to produce propaganda to shape public opinion, that cultural shift has also created new requirements, new expectations for citizens, right, who have also started to buy into the idea of democracy and the will of the people and all that. In traditional politics, again, rulers didn't really care all that much about what commoners thought, and they certainly didn't expect them to weigh in on policy matters, right? Like, how high should the tariffs be on trade? Should we go to war and annex this territory? But with modern ideas about the will and the sovereignty of the people have come the expectation that everyone should have an opinion about what's going on and what the government is supposed to do about it. So modern people, modern citizens are expected to be informed not just about, local gossip and the weather, but about tons of issues all around the world about which they have no direct personal experience or expertise. To be a good, responsible citizen nowadays, there's an expectation that you have to read the news and have an opinion about everything. This is a point that Hannah Arendt and Harry Frankfurt also got at, you might remember, right? There's this pressure to have opinions about everything. And both those authors say that this is part of what leads people to believe lies and also to try and bullshit their way through when they're talking about stuff that they know nothing of. Ellul would agree, I think, and he also says that information alone isn't enough to fix the problem of the demand on citizens that they be informed. Actually, it makes the problem worse. Even when a person does read the news every day, does commit to this ritual of informed citizenship, information can just confuse more than it enlightens, right? The news, as Ellul describes it, the news describes kind of a scattering of events from all over the place, and it leaves out important context. Often it lacks any clear resolution, right? Any answer to the question of so what? And then the next day, the news just moves on to totally new subjects. And so in Ellul's telling, what the news does is kind of just bombards people with information that doesn't make too much sense, at least without the simplifying, classifying guidance that propaganda provides as kind of a support for the newsreader. So Ellul writes, quote, "What happens next to a man who wishes to be informed and receives a great deal of news each day? First, straight news reporting never gives him anything but factual details. The event of the day is always only a part, for news can never deal with the whole. If you shower the public with the thousands of items that occur in the course of a day or a week, the average person, even if he tries hard, will simply retain thousands of items that mean nothing to him. He would need a remarkable memory to tie some event to another that happened 3 weeks or 3 months ago. Moreover, the array of categories is bewildering. Economics, politics, geography, and so on, and topics and categories change every day. To obtain a rounded picture, one would have to do research, but the average person has neither the desire nor the time for it. As a result, he finds himself in a kind of kaleidoscope in which thousands of unconnected images rapidly follow each other. His attention is continually diverted to new matters, new centers of attention, and is dissipated on 1,000 things, which disappear from one day to the next. The world becomes remarkably changeable and uncertain. He feels as though he is at the hub of a merry-go-round and can find no fixed point or continuity. Man can never stand back to get a broad view because he immediately receives a new batch of news which supersedes the old and demands a new point of focus, for which our reader has no time. To the average man who tries to keep informed, a world emerges that is astonishingly incoherent, absurd, and irrational, which changes rapidly and constantly for reasons he cannot understand. The news is only about trouble, danger, and problems. This gives man the notion that he lives in a terrible and frightening era, that he lives amid catastrophes in a world where everything threatens his safety. Man cannot stand this. He cannot stand to live in an absurd and incoherent world, nor can he accept the idea that the problems which sprout all around him cannot be solved, or that he himself has no value as an individual and is subject to the turn of events. The man who keeps himself informed needs a framework in which all this information can be put in order. He needs explanation and comprehensive answers to general problems. He needs coherence. And he needs an affirmation of his own worth. All this is the immediate effect of information. And the more complicated the problems are, the more simple the explanations must be. The more difficult the question, the more all-embracing the solution. The more menacing the reduction of his own worth, the greater the need for boosting his own ego. all this propaganda, and only propaganda, can give him. So propaganda helps us make sense of the world, makes the world coherent to us, which is a point that should be getting kind of familiar by now, right? From Stuart Hall and Hannah Arendt, we've seen similar arguments. Ellul says that because information overload is a big part of the problem, literacy and education are actually no armor against propaganda, right? In fact, they actually make us need propaganda all the more. That's why Ellul says that it's middle classes and intellectuals who are actually most vulnerable to propaganda, and not, the extreme poor who might not be able to read, and even if they can, they're too busy trying to survive to be bothered by all the information out there, or by the pressure of this, the pressure of the expectation that they be a good informed citizen, or kind of the pressure created by all these fears that they're bombarded with the pressure to come up with simple solutions. So also, Ellul's explanation relatedly for why the Soviet Union and Communist China put such tremendous effort into achieving mass literacy in the 20th century, right, is that people needed to be able to read to make information retrievable to them, and so to feel the need for propaganda to make sense of all that information. And it's not just that propaganda helps people to make sense of the world, but that it allows them to do so in particular ways that satisfy some of their other deeply felt needs that have been produced by the shift to a mass individualist society. Ellul argues that the loss of traditional ways of associating with people and the loss of traditional answers, religious answers, for example, to big meaning of life kind of questions, the effect of this was that it created a psychological and a moral vacuum. To Ellul, the modern world is a very lonely place, and one in which people are also asked to make all kinds of sacrifices, right? There are big, potentially deadly sacrifices that are demanded of citizens. Right? For example, you get conscripted into the military and have to go off and kill people or be killed by people you've never met and don't have any personal reason to dislike. And particularly after World War I, right, when you had this, on a massive scale, mechanized killing and dehumanization of the soldiers living in trenches, being constantly bombarded by artillery and machine gun and stuff like this, there was a real questioning going on in society of like, is this all meaningless? What's the point of all this? Why are we fighting these wars, right? There was an acutely felt lack of meaning behind the sacrifices that people were being asked to make. And if you're going to put yourself through the hell of modern war, it really helps then if you're convinced that you're fighting for a just cause, and also that the people across the battlefield from you are monsters. And so as Ellul says, quote, man must be plunged into a mystical atmosphere. He must be given strong enough impulses as well as good enough reasons for his sacrifices, and at the same time, a drug that will sustain his nerves and his morale. Patriotism must become, quote, ideological. By ideological, by the way, Ellul means kind of naturalized and unquestioned. So he goes on, only propaganda can put man into a state of nervous endurance that will permit him to face the tension of war. And note that here and elsewhere, Ellul is using almost this kind of quasi-religious terminology to talk about propaganda, as when he uses the term mystical, right? The mystical atmosphere that propaganda creates. And then, of course, also there are all these smaller, like everyday sacrifices and forms of despair that go along with being a cog in the wheel of what's really an impersonal and increasingly dehumanizing system of modern society, right? Whether the system is capitalistic or communist. Right, there's the kind of punch in, punch out routine of going to work every day, endlessly doing this fast-paced, stressful, but also kind of just mind-numbing task of whatever your job is in order to earn a wage to pay for, food and the rent in your sad little apartment. And life can kind of become meaningless, right? So Ellul goes on, quote, psychologists and sociologists are aware of the great problem of adjusting the normal man to a technological environment, to the increasing pace, the work hours, the noise, the crowded cities, the tempo of work, the housing shortage, and so on. Then there's the difficulty of accepting the never-changing daily routine, the lack of personal accomplishment, the absence of an apparent meaning in life, the family insecurity provoked by these living conditions, the anonymity of the individual in the big city and at work. The individual is not equipped to face these disturbing, paralyzing, traumatic influences. Here again, he needs a psychological aid. To endure such a life, he needs to be given motivations that will restore his equilibrium. And that's where propaganda comes in. Ellul goes so far as to call propaganda a cure for loneliness and a replacement for religion. Why? Well, because, again, propaganda consists of these simplifying, simple, often feel-good narratives that, quote, give man an all-embracing view of the world. And in this narrative, in this worldview, the person being propagandized always identifies them with the good guys in the propagandistic story, right? They're one of the heroes. So even if propaganda is worrisome, even if it's anxiety provoking, right, talking about the menacing enemy coming to get you of whatever kind, it's in a certain sense comforting because it sets out a simple story with clear good guys and bad guys, and you can be one of the good guys, right? So even if man's life is objectively pretty miserable, propaganda comes subjectively to the rescue, and it convinces him that he's respectable and he's righteous because he's joining the fight against whoever the enemy is, that he's one of the enlightened few, and he's not just another sucker being chewed up and spat out by the modern economy, right, contrary to all evidence, and participating in the ritual of propagandistic communication, whether just by believing what he's watching or maybe more actively by waving a flag or by joining in a demonstration or by committing a hate crime against whatever group the propaganda is demonizing. Through this participation, man becomes connected, at least symbolically, with all of the other true believers, with everyone else involved in the movement. He's no longer alone in a certain sense. Ellul, unfortunately, doesn't really have a kind of magic bullet solution to propaganda, I mean, any more than any of our other thinkers. He doesn't have a kind of solution at a big, systemic, large scale. He thinks that propaganda is inevitable, right, in the modern world, in the mass technological individualist society. Whether or not we think that we have a free press and are making up our own minds and forming our own worldviews and opinions, we're all significantly propagandized. And in fact, he thinks that the most dangerous kind of posture to adopt is one where we assume that we're not, right? That propaganda is a problem for somebody else, for our enemies, or for ignorant people, not like us well-educated, well-informed people. And in fact, to the contrary, right, instead of adopting the approach of, or the assumption that we are free thinkers, he thinks that in fact, if we can try to move through the world with a little bit more self-awareness of the fact that we're propagandized, that we're surrounded by propagandized, if we can be a bit more self-aware and self-critical in our posture rather than kind of adopting a arrogant know-it-all posture, then hopefully we can be constantly second-guessing our assumptions. We can question the simplistic narratives that we're being told. We can question really any story about the world that we're told in which we're unambiguously the heroes and whoever disagrees with us is evil or stupid. And I'd also like to add onto that a reminder that, of course, Ellul was exaggerating the extent to which we've all become just these isolated individuals connecting to the world only through mass media. We do still have connections to small groups, which, again, Ellul says can serve as protection, can serve as a bulwark against us being just completely enveloped by, consumed by mass propaganda. And I think that we should really, cultivate and value our membership in local groups, in local clubs, associations, religious communities, all of these kind of things. Now, both for better and for worse, right, these small groups nowadays are not so cut off from the rest of the world as they were back in the traditional societies Jacques Ellul talks about. And so small groups can themselves kind of serve as the vehicles of propaganda delivery, right? Some of you may have been getting, on your private sports team or religious study WhatsApp groups, been getting crazy, QAnon messages or stuff like this. So, unfortunately, the small group can also be a vehicle for propaganda, not just a defense against them. But hopefully also these small groups that we participate in can serve as spaces in which we connect with people who have different views than our own, who, connect with people who are at least propagandized in different ways. And, hopefully we can participate in small groups in which we, at least kind of productively argue it out with each other in these mini public spheres. And, maybe we can encourage each other to question the ideologies that each of us has internalized. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.